Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. And I just want to make sure I have everything going on. All right. Thank you all for standing by and welcome to our webinar entitled A Decision Tool to Optimize Drain Design for On-Site Wastewater and Stormwater Treatment Systems. This webinar series called Freshwater Science will highlight Ohio Sea Grant and partnering scientists every month. Every quarter is a different focus from human health and fish farming to harmful algal blooms and human decision making, bringing applied research to the public on issues that affect our Lake Erie communities. I am Jill Gentis Banicki from Ohio Sea Grant and Stone Laboratory, and joining me today is Dr. Vinnigat Shedeker from Ohio State University. Dr. Shedeker is an assistant professor at agricultural water management in the Department of Food, Agricultural, and Biological Engineering at Ohio State. He also serves as the director of the International Program for Water Management in Agriculture and the Overholt Drainage Education and Research Program in the Department of Food, Agricultural, and Biological Engineering. Dr. Shedeker's Ag Water team works at the intersection of soil health and agricultural water management for water quality and agricultural sustainability. He currently leads several research and extension projects focused on water management practices such as drainage and irrigation, smart water management solutions, and the development of innovative soil health and conservation practices, and farmer-friendly decision tools. We're delighted to have Dr. Shedeker here to talk to us about his Harmful Algal Bloom Research Initiative project. But before we do, just a few things about the webinar itself. During our presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Afterwards, around 12:20, I'll conduct a question and answer session. If you'd like to ask a question during the presentation, please feel free to pull up that chat feature at the bottom of your screen, and I'll collect and pose your questions out to Dr. Shedeker at the end of his presentation. We'll also do a little getting some feedback from you at the end of the question and answer session, so please feel free to stay on a little longer. As a reminder, this webinar has auto captioning and is being recorded to be posted onto our website for later viewing. We'll also post a webinar survey in the chat feature toward the end of the half an hour. If you could take a few minutes after the webinar to fill out that survey, it will help us continue to bring you great webinars. So without any further delay, I'd like to introduce Dr. Shedeker presenting a decision tool to optimize drain design for on-site wastewater and stormwater treatment systems. Dr. Shedeker.
Thank you, Jill. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to be on this webinar. Really excited to be here. Today we're going to share with you some of the work that we did as part of this HABRI project, as I call it, the Harmful Algal Bloom Research Initiative that's funded through the Ohio Department of Higher Education. And I do want to acknowledge the big team that's been behind this effort. In addition to Ohio State team, we had a collaboration extending to Michigan State University and North Carolina State University. I also want to make a special mention of our advisory board. A lot of the work that we did was something that we wanted to make sure we end up with a product that is more usable to the actual users, the boots on the ground, if you will. So Ohio Department of Health, Association of Ohio Pedologists, and OOWA, or the Ohio Onsite Wastewater Association, and of course the Ohio Stormwater Association and NRCS. So there is a lot of folks that actually provided us with a lot of good advice on the way we started developing this tool. So with that, I'm gonna head into the introduction part of my presentation. As you can imagine, we are trying to focus on two kinds of systems with drainage as a common theme between those. So when it comes to rural septic systems or on-site wastewater treatment systems, We think that this may be more applicable to specific kinds of systems and not so much applicable to the other kinds that are used. So, for example, your conventional septic systems or a drip distribution system or a mound system, wherever you can think about interaction between the groundwater table and that septic system. When it comes to urban stormwater systems, we're mainly focused on the stormwater practices that are retaining more water underground, such as permeable pavements, which allow for more infiltration, and bioretention areas, which are essentially temporary storage areas for the stormwater to allow for more treatment of that water. As I said, the common denominator here is the way we get rid of excess water from these systems, and that's where the drainage plays a role. When it comes to rural septic systems, which I will tend to focus a little more, I just wanted to put a graphic out here for those who have less of a background in how these systems look like. Unlike big cities where you do have a wastewater treatment plant that is able to receive all the wastewater that is generated from the individual residential areas or commercial areas and be treated at those plants. In rural areas, a lot of times the household has to send all their water into a what we call an on-site septic system, where you would have a septic tank for solids to settle down, and then you have that wastewater that potentially has some pollutants or biological components that you want to get rid of before it can be disposed of. So the typical way is to dispose that water off in your in the soil at a certain depth, with the expectation that the soil acts as the treatment media and removes the majority of the pollutants or the pathogens that are in that water. As you can see, the moment you have this kind of a setup, you have to think about what kind of soils you have. You have to think about how far they are from the groundwater, whether or not there is potential for that water or the wastewater or the pathogen-led water to interact with any of the groundwater sources or surface water sources for that matter. So that's where the risk factor comes in. Another factor that plays a role is the condition of that septic system itself. This is a survey report from Ohio Department of Health from 2012. And what you see is they divided the whole state into different zones and then essentially looked at the failure rate or number of systems that are failing for one reason or another, and it's a alarmingly high number. And of course, there are initiatives at state level that are looking at resolving this issue, but close to 200,000 systems are in a pretty bad shape, which means some of them are potentially leaking wastewater into your soils or groundwaters, or some of them are failing for a completely different reason. Clogging is a good example for that. So regardless of what it is, I think a combination of a failing septic system and shallow groundwater together might be a more concerning situation. Especially we live in a state where we have more than 4 million acres of soils that tend to have shallow water table at specific times of the year. So what you see here is a map that is color coded for depth to saturation or depth down to groundwater. And you can see more than 50% of our soils, especially in Northwest Ohio and Northeast Ohio, have a very high level of groundwater level, or seasonally high groundwater level. That has the potential to interact with these septic systems and the leachate that comes out of those. So, of course, when a designer is trying to design a system, they are aware of this. The soil scientists who are making the assessment for this, they are aware of it. And there are rules that are supposed to be applied where you design a system that would work in considering this kind of a risk. So as I said, it can exacerbate the environmental as well as the health risk if it's a combination of this failing system and the high water table. Simple way to mitigate this issue is, let's say you have a high water table condition, seasonally high water table condition, and these are the trenches that you saw where the water table is, where the wastewater is coming in. Technically, you're supposed to allow for some kind of a separation distance so that the water, the wastewater has time to travel through the soil for enough of a distance and time that it has received the treatment that is necessary to remove the pathogens and other pollutants. If you provide a artificial drainage system around that, in older days, these were called curtain drains. Now we call them engineered drains. They perform pretty much the same function, is to lower that water table below the trenches so that you are maintaining a specific vertical separation distance. And that specific vertical separation distance is required to be maintained for a certain number of days. Now, technically, like, if you, in an ideal world, you would want this kind of situation for all 365 days of the year. But we live in a state where we get 40 inches of rain. We always have saturation conditions, and you know for sure that your system is never going to be in this kind of a scenario for like continuous time. You will have some incidents when the water table temporarily comes up and then goes down. And you want to minimize that fluctuation by having a drainage system. And then essentially, you want to know how many days it might happen. So if you look at the Ohio's administrative code that guides the design for these septic systems, there is language there that tells you that the thickness of the unsaturated soil, which is that vertical separation distance, has to be maintained at a certain depth. Typically, it is 12 inches below the trench for at least 330 days out of the year, out of 365. So there is about 30 days that you can violate this criteria and still be okay with it. And then it has to happen consistently over at least 30% of the duration. In other words, at least 9 years out of a 30-year record, you should have this condition fulfilled. It's a pretty lenient criteria, but I believe this criteria was selected knowing the conditions, the limiting conditions we have in our state. The water table does come up within the 12 inches or 18 inches of surface too often. So there is, of course, a way to look at this criteria again, and I know that there is a state level committee that revisits this criteria and many other rules as it relates to the septic system. So our job was simply to take this rule and apply it using a modeling approach so that someone who is designing a system gets something of a quantification based on a process-based model so that they can then use to inform their design. The design decision that needs to be made is for the depth and the spacing that you have to select for these drains, the drains that you're putting in. The deeper the drain, the faster the reaction is going to be. The closer the drains, the faster the reaction is going to be for the water table drawdown. And the further apart you put them, it's going to be slower. So it's a decision that a designer has to make for this criteria. So maintain 12 inches for at least 330 days, and 9 out of 30 years that this condition has to be fulfilled is kind of the logic that we are using for this design criteria. And it's a simple optimization problem that I am more familiar with from our background here in agricultural drainage. This is what we do in agricultural drainage, is to try to optimize the drainage spacing and depth to make sure you are getting the full benefit of or the uniform benefit of drainage for your crops across the entire field, and that is the optimum drain spacing or drain depth. So we have a ability to kind of utilize somewhat similar thinking, even if we are looking at non-agricultural systems. And the way we do this is using a prediction model called DrainMod. Now, DrainMod is a kind of a field scale, one-dimensional model that looks at the soil profile between the two drain pipes, and it simply simulates the hydrology where this red cursor is. It simulates how high the water table can go and how low it can go in response to rainfall events, in response to weather events, and so on. So the weather data typically that is needed to run this model is daily rainfall and maximum and minimum temperature. We also rely on a lot of soil physical properties that, such as the hydraulic conductivity of the soil, for being able to predict how fast or slow that water is moving through the soil profile. In this case, we do not have to worry about any crops. Maybe there is some lawn or grass growing, and but essentially crops are essential to decide what depth the root zone extends to. And the outputs that we get from this model are more than what we need for this specific project. Typically, for this project, we were more focused on being able to read the water table depth prediction that you get on daily basis. You also have the ability to look at trafficable days, but again, as I said, this is more for agricultural purposes. Crop yield, again, not relevant here, but water budget, which shows you how much drainage there might be, how much runoff, evapotranspiration, soil moisture, and seepage. All of those components get predicted by this model. We have used this model. We have worked with Ohio Department of Health. My predecessor, Dr. Larry Brown, had led a project in 2008 where we took about 50 soils from Ohio and ran this model, generated an outcome, put it in the spreadsheets, and made it available for ODH and the county level health departments to use. I also helped with this second phase of this project where we took another 60 soils and from Ohio and reran the model and then generated data. And it was all static data that we generated one time, and only for about 100 out of the 400 soil series that we have in Ohio. So really the thinking was, can we automate this process and take the expert out of the equation and simply provide an interface for septic system designers to do this kind of exercise for any soil that you can choose in Ohio. So that's kind of the idea. So our project objectives were to develop, first thing was to develop a state level database for weather data, soils data. Second objective was to develop protocols as it relates to that modeling platform. And then the third objective was to actually develop a web interface and that is able to not only run the model in the background, but really able to create a report that a designer can then download and attach that with their design documents for approval process. So that's kind of the idea for this whole project. As I said, we are visioning out that it will be a map-based web interface where you can zoom in and select a site for being able to run the model. I did want to just put a plug in again for the outstanding team that's been working on this. As I said, Knowledge Exchange was a entity at Ohio State who had the kind of the technical expertise on being able to develop web-based tools and interfaces. This here is my team, my postdoc and student team. And then we had our PIs from OSU as well as NC State and Michigan State. So the first part that we did was more on the protocol development and being able to prove that you can use this model for the purposes of evaluating the suitability of engineered drainage systems. So Ahmed, who is a postdoc with my group, he is working on a manuscript out of this. What he did was he took two hypothetical scenarios for two different house sizes that essentially are going to generate different amounts of water this was, I think, based on about 120 gallons per day criteria that a single bedroom house would generate. And we converted that into how many inches or centimeters you would be discharging into that system based on 1 or 2 bedroom residential unit. And he took 3 counties in Ohio and 3 poorly drained soils in Ohio, and essentially ran the model, assuming there is no drainage system, but only a septic system installed. And if this line was below this dashed red line 10 times, that is the criteria that we're fulfilling. And you can see there is nothing that is below the red line, which essentially means that we're failing that criteria as per the Ohio Revised Code for all of the 30 years that we did the simulation. So what he did was he took the same soils, same counties, and then ran the model again with a drainage system in conjunction with the septic system. And now you can see the green line is the water table depth, number of days that water table depth is within that critical zone or away from the critical zone. And as soon as you bring in the engineered drains, you have the ability to fulfill that criteria, and which was true for a single bedroom dwelling based on the standard drainage that we had. But when he applied the same spacing and depth for dwelling that had a little more discharge coming through a couple of counties, it failed. So you can see that it's optimization problem that can be easily solved by simply playing with the drainage design. So then he went in and changed some of the drainage design parameters, and he was able to get the criteria fulfilled by simply either putting drains deeper, putting drains closer, or increasing the trench length, which means you're distributing the water over a larger area. So there are solutions that we were able to propose. This was more of a protocol development for us. And then eventually what we thought was you could come up with a optimization table like this, where you have a recommended spacing and depth, and then anything in the gray is not suitable, anything in the white is suitable. So this is the kind of visual that a designer can then adopt in their design, in their scenarios. The second person that did something with this project was Tony, who was a master's student, and she did 2 things. She looked at not just today's data, but she also looked at future climate scenarios and actually looked at how the septic systems and the drainage that goes with those septic systems might perform in future climate scenarios. She also tested DrainMod to be able to simulate stormwater hydrology. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this, but the conclusion was that in future, we would have less number of days that there is interference overall in a year, but actually that will be, we will have greater risk during the spring and winter months of the water table being shallower because of the intense precipitation we're going to get. And she also proved that we could easily use DrainMod to predict stormwater system hydrology, the complete water budget. So it was kind of a verification. So I'm going to take maybe 2 more minutes to quickly show you how this tool that we have right now, it's in a beta version. We had some delays on the 2-year projects. We have 6 more months to actually get this tool to the finish line. I had already promised for the webinar, so I'm showing you a beta version that is under work. This is kind of a layout that shows how the tool is designed. But here is a quick video that hopefully will work. That shows you that, so we decided to zoom in and select a kind of a site near a building here on campus at OSU. This is actually our Waterman farm. So as soon as you click here, it populates the location and it brings in all the soil information for that location. It brings in the weather data for that location. And then there are some user inputs that you can enter in terms of the septic system design parameters, which is that trench design, and the drainage system parameters. And then there are some additional parameters that are automatically populated, but it's as simple as putting in what you have in your design and then clicking the submit button. And then between the submit and the download, there was a fraction of a second that the model actually ran in the background and spit out a report that you can download or visualize on the interface. So as I said, the work is still in progress on this tool. It's not publicly available right now. This is what we have as our vision for the tool. Eventually, when it is completely ready for people to use, some basic inputs. We hope to have some help commands for folks to be able to refer to, and then we will have a run command, and then we hope that there would be some advanced users that would want to download the model files to be able to run the model on their own. This is an interface that you see for the septic system side of things. We have a slightly different interface that is for the stormwater practices. A user, when they come to the website, they will select with what they want to simulate, and that will direct them to the septic system versus the stormwater system interface. As I said, this is what we imagine the report would look like. Some basic summary of the inputs that went into the drain mod, some kind of a table that shows you the optimum spacing or design for drainage systems, and some annual summaries. So on the stormwater side, hydrologic summaries is where we concluded that was going to be the most used instead of designing a drainage system. But you, in stormwater conditions, you always are interested in what the annual discharges might look like, what might be the peak runoff rates, and so on. And you can get all that information based on this model run. So again, a lot of work that I showed you is still in progress, but I'm really proud of how far we have come on this. And I'm hoping within the next 3 to 5 months, we will have a better version that we would release for folks to use and maybe provide us some inputs on it as well. I'm sure we will have issues to fix, bugs to fix, but the main thing would be to make this available for folks to use, and then we'll continue the development of it. I think that's what I have, Jill. I forgot to share my slide with the contact information. I'll keep that on, but I'm happy to answer any questions if people have, if I have left any time for Q&A.
You do. And what I'll do too, is in the email going out to everyone with the recording, I'll also add your contact information in there for anyone who would like to follow up with you, too. So so people don't have to immediately write things down here. I'll send some things everyone's way. Okay, well, first question that we got was, we were asked if this tool would be available to municipalities in other states like New York. Oops, I think you're muted. Sorry, Dr. Shidekar.
Sorry. Yeah. Thanks, Scott, for that question. I know Scott. He's from Indiana, so I'll say this. We'll run this at a cost for you. Just kidding. Right now, we wanted to create a tool that serves as a pilot project for one state, but I see a great potential for this to be expanded over multiple states eventually. It will be very easy for us to expand it, but there will be some effort that will need to be put into it. We spent 1 year collecting data for Ohio and creating protocols for how to convert that into the input. So that's the part that needs to be done, but I'm confident we can do it.
We actually, any other questions that I had gotten, you answered them. So, if you Would you want to now allow people to give you feedback? Because I can, if people were to raise their hands, using the raise hand feature at the bottom of the screen, I can unmute people and they can ask question or give you feedback. Is that what I want to make sure I'm getting what you're wanting from
Yes.
folks.
So what I thought about was we did get some advice from our advisory panel, but I would love to hear from folks who are more into this profession where yeah, what you think is the applicability of a tool like this. If you have any suggestions for us to implement while we are in the development phase, I would love to have that opportunity now. Never imagined I'd be talking to 75 people about this tool. I thought our audience was much smaller, but uh, I think that was what I had on my mind, that even if we run out of time, if people wanted to stay back and talk to me about the any suggestions you may have or any additional usage you may see in this tool, I'd be happy to hear. I did notice one more comment here. Katie made a comment, and I want to give a shout out to Katie. She was actually the project coordinator for our team, that was on the web interface development, and how far we have come is probably a lot of credit goes to Katie for that. So I appreciate Katie is online here in this audience.
Well, no wonder she was saying it was a very cool tool.
She knows, when she left, she knows what shape we were in. So this has come a long way.
All right. Well, that's great. Right now, so I don't see any hands up. So maybe people are going to listen to the recording again and get their questions figured out and reach out to you independently. So far, I
Yeah,
don't see any hands unless I'm mistaken here.
no worries. I know that there were some questions that were submitted ahead of this webinar, and I hope I was able to answer some of them. I think one of those questions was about out of state
Mm-hmm.
uh, availability for this tool. So
All right.
contact information again. Yes,
Okay.
I absolutely I can. So
All right. Well, if I don't see any hands up, so what I can do is I can kind of end the webinar by saying that I want to thank Dr. Shedeker for his willingness to talk to us about his research. Really, thank you so much, Dr. Shedeker, for being on. I would also like to remind everyone that the survey URL for this webinar is in the chat feature, so please take a few minutes to fill that out. This webinar series is sponsored by Ohio Sea Grant and will continue on in February with Ohio State's Dr. Justin Chaffin, who will be discussing his research in the HABS arena. I will be sending that link to you all soon. Thank you again, Dr. Shedeker. We really appreciate you being willing to talk about your research. This is a really cool project. And I may have you come on again once it's all set. So be
I'll be
prepared.
happy.
You'll see something from me here probably soon. Um,
Yep.
Again, thank you again, Dr. Shedeker. This was really great. Hope everyone thought this was beneficial, and thanks again, and have a great afternoon. Thank you again, Dr. Shedeker. This was great.
Thank you very much, and have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you.